Thank you very much for coming to this presentation. It's really good to be back for another edition of the Chinese DiGRA conference. I will be presenting again on the regulation of loot boxes. We'll be looking both at the situation in mainland China, but also in Taiwan. Now, to start with, let's define what a loot box is. Now, these are in-game purchases that you can make inside video games. What makes loot boxes different from other in-game purchases is that the potential rewards are randomized. When you decide to make a purchase, you do not know what you will receive. As you can see in the screenshot on the right-hand side of the screen, that's a loot box from Apex Legends. The chance for a player to obtain a legendary item is only 7.4%. That means that on average, a player needs to open more than 10 loot boxes on average to obtain one of those legendary items. These mechanics are conceptually similar to gambling because the player is spending real-world money on a randomized process, and most of the time they will end up losing, but very rarely they will win by obtaining a rare reward. Loot box purchasing has been found to be positively correlated with problem gambling, including in mainland China. This suggests that people who purchase loot boxes may be a vulnerable group of consumers that may experience harm. These mechanics have been very controversial and have also been subject to regulatory scrutiny across the world. Now, I'm just going to play a video of what it looks like to open a loot box. Now, I would ask you to focus on the audio and visual effects. Now, that is a loot box that only presented the player with a rare reward. Now, this will be very disappointing to most players, and what most will do is move on to a different loot box. So let's do that as well. Let's open another loot box. Again, focus on the audio and visual effects. Now, that is one of those rare times when the player has obtained a legendary reward. You would have noticed that the audio effects were louder and the screen was brighter. Now, we don't know whether or not these very exciting imagery actually causes players to spend more money on loot boxes. However, certainly video game companies are implementing these into their loot box design. Now, how popular are these mechanics in video games? We have looked at the situation amongst the highest grossing or most popular iPhone games in multiple countries around the world. In the UK and in Western countries generally, about 80% of the video games now on mobile platforms will contain loot boxes. Whilst in East Asia, we're looking at a prevalence rate of above 90%. So it does seem that in East Asia, these mechanics are more accepted and certainly more widely available. When we are counting loot boxes, we are also including the so-called social or simulated casino games where players can spend real-world money to participate in traditional gambling activities. However, what is different here between these kinds of games and traditional gambling is that even if the player wins, they cannot convert any winnings back into real-world money. Arguably now, these are worse than real gambling because the player can never actually win. But these games are not regulated as gambling, but because they include these in-game purchases with randomization, we include them under the loot box definition. We're also including under this definition these gacha mechanics that people would have observed in games produced in East Asian countries. Now you'll see that no box is being opened, however, the mechanic operates on the same principle. The player is getting random rewards. Now, these blue rewards are not valuable at all, but very rarely the player will be able to obtain a purple or a orange reward, much more valuable, and those rewards are actually what the player is looking for. Now, this is one of those purple rewards. Now, one approach that countries have adopted to address potential concerns associated with loot boxes is to require so-called probability disclosures. I've got two examples, one in Chinese and one in English, on the presentation at the moment. Now, these percentages are intended to inform players of their likelihood of getting different items. So hopefully players will realize that the amount of money that may be required on average to obtain a certain item is so much that they would be dissuaded from spending too much money on these mechanics. Now, so in 2017, that's when mainland China started first requiring probability disclosures. But for a very long time, nothing really has happened in other places. In other places, we've always been looking at the industry self-regulating by requiring probability disclosures. However, more recently, Taiwan and South Korea have started requiring probability disclosures as well, whilst other European countries have made it very clear that these should also be required, either as industry self-regulation or as a legal requirement. So what we have are these previous studies that looked at how prevalent loot boxes are in Western countries, and also sometimes whether or not those loot boxes disclose probabilities. The main takeaway here is that certainly in East Asia, the prevalence rate is higher, and also that the disclosure rate is higher, likely because the requirements are legally imposed, and also perhaps companies are more willing to comply with regulations in this region. What we have done this year is to look beyond just mainland China and also towards other places. This included South Korea and also Taiwan. Quite interestingly, these other places have required very specific rules associated with loot boxes, and I'm going to be delving deeper into that in the subsequent slides. Now, first, we turn to mainland China. Now, in mainland China, it has been widely reported that probability disclosures have been required by law since 2017. However, actually, that piece of regulation has been retracted. Even though that has been retracted, probability disclosures has been required by General Consumer Protection Law. And in February of 2023, the Shanghai district, one of the Shanghai district's administrations for market regulation actually fined a game made in Shanghai for not making probability disclosures, because not making probability disclosures is a breach of General Consumer Protection Law, even though that dedicated piece of regulation is no longer with us. Now, here is a screenshot of that decision. They were fined 10,000 Chinese yuan, so not really very much in the context of things, but this did happen, and that's quite important. It's the first fine, I understand, in relation to loot boxes. So just to recall our previous results. So in 2022, what we found was that amongst the 100 highest grossing games, 91 of them contain loot boxes. When we looked at the situation again in 2024, 97 of them contain loot boxes. So again, very high prevalence rate. In fact, nearly all games in China are containing loot boxes at present. The other thing we looked at was, of course, the probability disclosure rate. That was 95.6% in 2020, and in 2024, that's become 96.9%. So again, that's been quite good. We have been able to find at least one loot box in those video games that has disclosed probabilities. Now, that is where our previous research stopped. What we have done with the study that we did this year is to go one step further. So what the law requires, of course, is not just that one loot box inside the game makes probability disclosures. No. In fact, what we do require is that every single loot box within the game do disclose their probabilities. Now, when we put the requirement as that, what we find is that only 10 of the 97 games, or about 10% of games, actually disclose probabilities for every loot box that we found within the game within 1 hour of gameplay. That means nearly 90% of games broke the law by failing to disclose probabilities for at least one loot box found. And this is just within 1 hour of gameplay. I think if we play the game for longer, we might well have also discovered other loot boxes that did not disclose probabilities in the 10 games here. I'll show you one example. So this is one of the most popular games, probably the most popular game in China, Honor of Kings, 王者荣耀. Now, in this game, you have many different loot boxes. For this one particular loot box, to access the probability disclosures, you tap on this tiny little button there. And by tapping on the button, you will be able to see the probability disclosures right there. However, this game also contains other loot boxes, such as this one, that has made no probability disclosure whatsoever. It just tells you that randomly you will receive a reward, but it doesn't say anything about the probabilities. Similarly, this is another example of a loot box contained within the game that says that it will randomly distribute rewards, but it doesn't say anything about the probabilities. Now, we move on to South Korea. Now, in South Korea, we only looked at the first loot box that we encountered within up to 1 hour of gameplay. This is because the study in mainland China has taught us that it takes just far too long. It's too resource intensive to look at 100 games for 1 hour each, and also to take notes for all of the games. So in South Korea, we found that 90% of the 100 highest grossing games contain loot boxes in 2024, and that about 85% of those games actually disclose probabilities for the first loot box found. Again, I think if we apply the stricter requirement that we applied in mainland China, that every loot box needs to disclose, I think the disclosure rate would be a lot lower. I would say that this 84.4% rate is more comparable to the just over 95% rate found in China. Although, of course, the Chinese rate would also have been higher because we looked at more loot boxes to find at least one that disclosed. Was in South Korea, we could only look at one loot box. So again, not entirely comparable, but more comparable to that data point. So in South Korea, we also identified an issue that we found in our previous research, which is that the probabilities are not often very easily accessible. Now, this is one of the good games. What you had to do in this game is to tap on the button on the top right-hand corner saying probability information. If you tap on that, you get access to the probabilities. Very good. However, in other games, you have to tap on a button that did not say anything about probabilities. So it wasn't clear that that button would have led you to the probabilities, such as that tiny little I button on the top left-hand corner. In other games, however, it was even worse. Now, this game's loot box purchase page does not have a link to the probability disclosure. Instead, what the page does is to tell players of the steps that they need to take to get to the probability disclosures, which specifically is to exit out from the loot box purchase screen, go into the settings, tap on a couple more buttons, and then go find the probabilities on an official web page that is linked to from within the game. Now, that's, of course, far more complicated than just tapping on one button. We also had examples in South Korea where there was just an error in implementation. Now, what should have happened in this game is that probabilities would have been revealed if the player tapped on the button on the top right-hand corner saying probability information. However, if the player tapped on that button, they're taken to this page saying that the page cannot be accessed, basically. We also tried it out with other loot boxes in this game, and we encountered the same error. So even though probability disclosures were supposed to be provided, they were not, in fact, given. Another requirement in South Korea is that games need to make very detailed probability disclosures. Broadly speaking, there are two different categories of probability disclosures. One's like this, where it's quite short and it tells you of the probabilities for getting different categories of items. So 1% chance of getting an epic item, but it doesn't tell you of the individual probabilities for getting every single item that falls within the epic category. Another way of disclosing probabilities is to make these individual item-based probabilities. So it would say that for each possible result, what the probabilities are. So for example, it tells you what the probabilities for getting 5 gems is and what the probabilities for getting 10 gems is. Now, the problem with category-based disclosures is for this game, for example, they could have just said 10% chance for getting gems. Now, that's of course misleading because it doesn't say that it's less than 1% chance to actually get 10 gems as compared to 9% chance of getting 5 gems. So when we focus on this more detailed requirement that individual item-based probability disclosures must be made, we found that only 62.2% of the games disclosed with individual item-based disclosures. Now that's a lower compliance rate. It seems that the stricter requirements has worse compliance. Now we turn to Taiwan. So what's required in Taiwan is that a specific message be attached to any loot boxes, telling the player that this is a chance-based product and that spending money or participating in an event does not guarantee that the player will obtain a specific item. Now, this screenshot is an example of what we observed in mainland China. So some games seem to have made the disclosure, this warning message rather, in mainland China as well. So what we wanted to do was to look at the situation in Taiwan to see the compliance rate with that requirement. Now, this is still a study that is in progress. We've only looked at 28 games at this moment. Of those 28 games, 27 of them contained loot boxes. So that's a prevalence rate of 96.4%. For the first loot box found within those games, only 63% of the games with loot boxes disclose probabilities. Now, I think this can be explained by a very, very high prevalence rate of social casino games, which tend not to make any sort of probability disclosures. Now, if we focus on the specific requirement to provide that warning message, we found that only 5 of the 27 games with loot boxes actually provided that message. I'm going to show you 5 examples. Now, this is a loot box purchase page, and you'll see at the bottom here that the game provides the relevant message about this being a chance-based event. Other games implemented the warning message as part of the probability disclosure up at the top. So again, reasonably prominent. However, there are worse examples. In this game, it is also included as part of the probability disclosures, but it is at the very bottom. So you have to open it up and scroll down to a second screen before you can see the relevant message. Now, of course, showing the message on the purchase screen would be the best. The worst example that we found is this message that was only available on the registration screen. And you'll see that it is hidden amongst other warning messages as well. And so we're not really sure how many players will really have seen this particular message. Providing this message in multiple locations would obviously be better. An interesting insight that this series of studies has given us is that we are now able to compare the situation of the same game in multiple countries. And this has revealed some really interesting things. I'll provide one example. The left is how this loot box is implemented in China. The one on the right is how this loot box is implemented in the UK. Now, in China, this game, or rather the company behind this game, was the company that was fined for not making probability disclosures. So in China, they now provide a button that, if clicked on, would provide the player with the probability disclosures. However, as you will see on the right-hand side, there is no button that leads the player to the probability disclosures, meaning that the game has not disclosed in the UK. Thanks again for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions.